It has haunted these waters for 100 years. Titanic.
Why go back to Titanic? What's left to be seen? The answer is everything.
A new expedition brings us closer than ever before.
It gives you that feeling of size and immensity.
For the first time, 3D cameras and advanced sonar technology capture startling new information.
This mission really gave us the ability to finally understand the Titanic wreck site.
Never before seen sections.
The 3D made it real and tangible.
And thousands of missing pieces.
It's a time capsule. You know that this object was used in 1912.
The most extensive high-tech exploration of Titanic ever.
Finally being able to see the big picture.
Reveals a 3D world no one could have imagined. One that brings astonishing new dimension to the stories of those who survived and those who did not. Out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, some 2.5 miles down, lies a patch of muddy ocean bottom, a place where few fish even venture. Yet it is the most studied and photographed piece of real estate in the deep ocean. Because this is the final resting place of Titanic. In 1912, it was the greatest ship ever built. At almost 900 feet, the largest moving man-made object on the planet. The builders and survivors of Titanic remember the legendary ship in their letters, journals, and testimony. Their actual first-hand accounts are as essential to understanding Titanic as all that lies on the bottom of the North Atlantic.
A novelty to be on the largest ship yet launched.
Take her to sea.
It's no exaggeration to say that it was quite easy to lose.
If you had seen or knew the process of actual work that went into this ship, you'd say it was impossible to sink her.
Titanic's engine configuration is designed to propel the ship at speeds over 20 knots. The ship is scheduled to complete its maiden transatlantic voyage in less than a week. But that record is denied when Titanic slips beneath the waves 100 years ago in the early hours of April 15th, 1912. Now, state-of-the-art 3D technology gives us the most complete look at the shattered ghost. In 2010, a unique team, including Woods Hole Oceanographic, RMS Titanic Inc., the Waite Institute, NOAA, and the History Channel, is assembled for an unprecedented expedition. Using the latest sonar and 3D imaging technology, they plan to explore and map the entire wreck site for the first time. 15 square miles. It will be the world's first look in real time at 3D images from the ocean floor, 2.5 miles below. The footage shocks even the most seasoned Titanic researchers.
In the submersible, I'm constrained to whatever I can see out of the 7-inch viewport and several inches of plexiglass. But with the 3D camera, it's almost like you're on the outside of the submersible because you've got this wide field of view. It's almost ethereal, like you're floating next to the wreck and seeing it with your own eyes.
In the past, a lot of the imagery that came back from Titanic was fairly high altitude and look down. And from this camera point, everything is flattened. The 2010 mission got down in the weeds and we started seeing profiles and oblique angles that we had not seen. And that itself is fascinating.
With the power of the 3D, you can literally be on the deck of Titanic. You can see more than you would if you were diving in a sub. And with that, you can connect to the past. You can vicariously experience not only the otherworldliness of Titanic as a ghost ship. You can also, with a good imagination, picture what it was like then, on that late night of April 14th and the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912.
Wednesday, April 10th, 1912. Titanic departs from Southampton, England, the second of 3 giant ocean liners built for the White Star Line. After brief stops in France and Ireland, Titanic set sail at 1:30 p.m. the following day for New York.
The world had waited expectantly for its launching. And
When our
again
boat left
for
the
its
dock, there
sailing.
were thousands of people at the pier, all of them waving goodbye and wishing the Titanic Godspeed on its first voyage.
The majority of Titanic's passengers are traveling in third class, emigrants on their way to a new life in America.
All third-class
It was a
passengers due here
beautiful
for health
ship,
inspection.
exactly like a city. It was so good,
We
it
are
was
shown to our
impossible to
berths
make it better.
and taken to see the dining room. A little later, we will shown where to get life belts and some other of the life-saving gear. None of us ever thought we would be needing it.
Welcome aboard.
Titanic's master is Edward Smith. At 62, he's one of the White Star Line's most experienced captains. He plans to retire at the end of this voyage.
How I can best describe my experience in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say uneventful. I've never been in any predicament that threatened to end in disaster of any sort.
Would you care for a drink, sir?
Yes, I'll take a mint julep.
Disaster is unimaginable for Titanic's first-class passengers, surrounded as they are by every luxury and convenience.
The ship was like a palace. My cabin was ripping. Hot and cold water, very comfy looking bed.
Fancy strawberries in April and in mid-ocean. Why, you'd think you were at the Ritz.
There was nothing to indicate or suggest that we were on the stormy Atlantic Ocean.
Titanic's second officer, 38-year-old Charles Lightoller, is also thankful for the fine weather.
From the moment we left Belfast, we had marvellous weather. It was as smooth as the proverbial mill pond.
Surprisingly, given her size, Titanic's engines are not the biggest. But greater efficiency makes the ship fast.
Engineers were very quick to realize that the reciprocating engines could now discharge into a turbine, and the turbine becomes kind of like an afterburner or a hybrid device. And with that power, you can actually drive a separate propeller. That's why most ships of Titanic's era have only 2 propellers. Titanic has 3, and the third one is to accommodate that centerline turbine.
Titanic's chief design engineer, Thomas Andrews, is on board, pursuing his dream to build the perfect ship.
Side of his bed, he had papers of all descriptions on his table during the day. He was working all the time.
Oh, I just love your dress.
Thank you. It's a Lucille gown. I hear the designer pulled it off.
Andrew's grand staircase has become iconic. On the night of April 13th, 1912, first-class passengers gather here to socialize and enjoy the grandeur of the space.
Up to that point, most naval architects, most interior decorators for ships had what's called a closed floor plan. In the case of Titanic, the staircases open up into these huge foyers. And at the base of the staircases, they open onto reception rooms. So it's an open floor plan. This was the first time on a British ship that ladies were able to make a grand entrance, a society entrance.
Jag är jättehungrig.
Mig också.
Below deck, things are less formal.
Pass that tarties, would you?
All right, doll, here you go.
White Star had a good reputation among immigrants. It was known for how well they treated their third class. To some, Titanic was the most luxury they'd ever seen in their lives.
April 14th, Titanic's 4th day at sea. Although there are sporadic reports of icebergs, Captain Smith feels confident enough to increase the ship's speed to 22 knots. Second Officer Charles Lightoller is on duty.
On that night of April the 14th, we all, that is, the captain and officers, knew perfectly well that we were just about entering the region where ice might be sighted at that particular time of year. and had taken all the necessary precautions.
Weather conditions were predicted to be clear, and the feeling at the time was it was okay to go full speed through a known region of ice. Some considered it preferred because they felt that if the ship was making its best speed, it was also at its best maneuverability.
We were steaming that night at a good 22 knots. At 10 o'clock, I was relieved as officer of the watch by Murdoch, W.M. Murdoch. He and I had been shipmates in many of the ocean greyhounds, and both of us had crossed this ice region times without number. After the usual formalities, I handed over, wished him joy of a few perishing cold hours, and went below. I expect his watch went on as mine had done. Nothing to see and nothing to hear except the distant roar of the water at her bows. That and the half-hourly bells with the lookout men's cry of "All's well." Of course, he knew nothing of the death trap laying ahead of us, any more than I did.
100 years after Titanic's maiden voyage, 3D cameras are casting new light on the events of April 14th and 15th, 1912.
There were 3 sharp clangs on the crow's nest bell, followed by a cry from the lookout cage. "Ice right ahead, sir!"
The call comes from 24-year-old Frederick Fleet, one of the men on duty in the crow's nest.
The masts are made out of steel and they're hollow. There's actually a ladder inside. And when you get to the crow's nest level, there's an oval aperture in the steel, and you simply climb out. On either side, you can still see the grab rails.
90 feet above the ocean, Frederick Fleet rings this bell, recovered from the wreck site.
He rang a bell 3 times, which is an audio signal to everybody on board that there is a collision hazard exactly on course with the ship. And then he turns around and picks up the telephone, and the only person you can talk to is the bridge. And he says, "Ice right ahead, sir."
39-year-old William Murdoch is first officer and in command on the bridge.
Murdoch evidently saw the mass of ice practically at the same time as the lookout men did and shouted, "Hard a starboard!"
When Murdoch gets the call, his next step is to go to the telegraphs and take both handles and move them to the full astern position. The telegraphs simply signal the engine room that they need a change in speed, and it's up to the engineers to effect that change.
His idea was to swing her bow clear and then put the helm hard over the other way and so swing her stern clear.
And it wasn't just turning the bow to port, because ships don't steer like cars. They steer from the stern, where the rudder is. So you turn the stern and the bow follows. So as soon as you got the bow moving, Murdoch had to reverse the helm and kick the stern away.
And given half a chance, I believe he'd done it. But going at that speed, it was too late. As it was, her bow swung a bit, but not enough, and she struck.
What was that? Did you feel that too?
We had retired to our stateroom, and the noise of the collision was not at all alarming.
When the ship struck, if one had a brimful glass of water in hand, the shock was so slight, not a drop would have been spilled.
My first knowledge that all was not well was when a steward pounded on the door and his cries awakened me.
Get your lifebelts on!
Second Officer Lightoller is now off duty in the officers' quarters, directly behind the bridge.
I was laying in my bunk when I felt the slight jar. No sense of collision, but more of a shiver ran through the ship. Anyway, it was enough to bring me out my bunk in one jump. Out on the deck, I ran to one side and then to the other. But there wasn't a trace of anything we'd struck, so back I went to my bunk and waited.
Below deck, the situation is more dire. 28-year-old fireman Frederick Barrett is working in boiler room 6.
I shouted, "Shut all the dampers," and that order was obeyed. But the crash came before we had them all shut. There was a rush of water into my stokehole. I jumped through the doorway into number 5 section. The watertight door between the section was then open, but it shut just as we jumped through.
Now, the ship has just 2 hours and 40 minutes to live.
She took the blow along her starboard side, masses of ice actually falling on the foredeck. But what was worse, she was pierced below the waterline in no less than 6 compartments. And from that moment, nothing could have saved her.
Most passengers and crew still don't know that Titanic has suffered a mortal blow.
It wasn't long before Boxall, the 4th officer, poked his head round my door and said, "You know we've struck an iceberg." "I know you've struck something," I told him, not thinking that it was anything serious and feeling none too pleased. Then he said, "The water's up to F-deck in the mailroom." There was no need for him to say anything more. I was into a pair of pants, sweater and breech coat and out on the deck almost as soon as he was.
What's going on? What's this absurd noise?
Now, we'd been running under a big head of steam, and the sudden stopping of the engines lifted every safety valve, and as a result, the steam roared off at all exhausts. The row was absolutely deafening. Shout as loud as you like. No one could hear a word.
It's obvious the ship isn't going to go anywhere. So what they do is they open relief valves, and huge cascades of steam shoot out of the tops of the funnels.
Design engineer Thomas Andrews races through the ship to inspect the damage. 25 minutes later, he reports to the bridge and informs the captain of his terrible calculation. In an hour, 2 at most, the ship will go down.
I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat. Just about now, thank goodness, the roar of escaping steam stopped, and the passengers, now they could hear themselves think, started asking me, "Why are you getting the boats out? And why are you putting women and children in them?" I told them that it was merely a precaution and that very likely they'd all be taken on board again at daylight.
Women and children, your attention, all women.
We went on deck and everything seemed quiet and orderly. The orchestra was playing a lively tune. There was
A man
little
came to me and put a life jacket on me, assuring me it was only taking precautions and
My
not
father
to be
went
alarmed.
away and spoke to one of the sailors and came back and said, "We've hit an iceberg.
We've hit an iceberg.
They're going to launch the
They're gonna
lifeboats,
launch the
but you'll all be
lifeboats,
back
but
on
you'll
board
be
for
back on board
breakfast."
for breakfast.
Getting into a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean is a trial. The boats carried cranes called davits, and the davits pick the lifeboat up and then swings it over the side of the ship. And normally there's a gap of maybe a foot or so, 18 inches. It took a lot of courage to get across that gap because it's a sheer drop of several stories to the ocean.
Come on!
Up to the time of getting away the first few boats, no one believed that the ship was actually in any danger. I'm afraid my own confidence that she wouldn't or couldn't sink rather conveyed itself to others. For there were actually cases where women absolutely refused to be put in a boat.
"I just want to go back to my room."
As the lifeboats were being launched, many of the first cabin passengers expressed their preference of staying on the
At first,
ship.
the boats were loaded among joking crowds, and some women refused to go into them, feeling safer aboard the ship, which they said was
You could
unsinkable.
not get people to go on the lifeboats. You could not. They felt safer on the Titanic than in
I
the
remember one young couple, evidently not long married, walking up and down the boat deck. I asked the girl, she was only a girl, from the Western States I should say, if I should put her in the boat, but no. She wouldn't be parted from her husband. "Not on your life," she said. "We've started together and we'll finish together." Brave girl. But she didn't know how near that finish was. Certainly I didn't.
A new expedition is mapping the Titanic wreck site in groundbreaking detail, capturing stunning 3D images of newly explored sections of Titanic. It's allowing us to rediscover what happened that fateful night in the North Atlantic 100 years ago. 12:15 a.m., April 15th, 1912. 35 minutes after Titanic strikes the iceberg. Chief radio operator, 25-year-old Jack Phillips, and his assistant, 22-year-old Harold Bride, begin sending out distress signals.
The captain put his head into the cabin. "We've struck an iceberg. Send the call for assistance."
They were a little incredulous at first, but Being professionals, they immediately set about the task of trying to find anybody within range that could come to their assistance. Phillips worked the key the entire night.
Phillips began to send CQD. He flashed away at it, and we were all joking while he did. All of us made light of the disaster. We joked that way while he flashed signals for about 5 minutes. Then the captain came back. "What are you sending?" he asked.
What are you sending?
CQD, Phillips replied. "Send SOS," I said. "It's the new call and it may be your last chance to send it." Phillips changed the signal to SOS.
SOS, the newly adopted distress call for ships at sea, is tapped out over Titanic's state-of-the-art wireless technology. The signal sounds very different from other ships transmitting that night.
The old plane spark transmitter had this very ragged sound to it. It was a... Titanic's was more like what you think of today. Dee, 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 dee. So, out of all of these spark sets out there transmitting back and forth, high above it is this dee, 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 and it's the death call of Titanic above all these others. And it's got to have been very eerie to have heard that, this very unmistakable voice above all the others saying, "We're dying, come help us."
On the boat deck, Lightoller and the officers begin forcibly placing women and children into the lifeboats.
Just when I first realised how desperately serious things were, I don't know. But I do know that before many boats were away, I got to piling more and more people into them. Partly because I knew she was going, and partly because the boats weren't remaining by the ship to be filled to their capacity.
Bring the boats alongside. Bring the boats alongside.
Titanic carried 2 megaphones. They're made out of sheet aluminum. Normally they're used when the ship comes into port, but that night, during the commotion on the boat deck, Captain Smith is reputed to have picked up the megaphone and shouted orders.
I heard the commander 2 or 3 times hail through the megaphone to bring the boats alongside, and I presumed he was alluding to the gangway doors, giving orders to the boats to go to the gangway doors.
As the situation grows more desperate, the crew begins setting off distress rockets.
These are the actual rocket engines that were used to shoot up distress signals. There's been discussion about the color of Titanic's rockets. They've always been depicted as being all white. But this is evidence that they did have colored rockets. If Titanic fired up different colored rockets, somebody seeing it might think that there was some kind of company signals instead of a consistent distress signal.
Titanic's distress rockets go unanswered. Her passengers and crew remain alone in the cold North Atlantic, fighting for their lives.
It was plain to me that if we were going to avoid the unutterable disgrace of going down with boats still hanging at their davits, we've got not only to take chances, we've got to work like blazes.
The lifeboats were nests of 4 on the deck, and after the lifeboats were launched, the ropes, the falls that used to connect to the lifeboats are just hanging there. When the Titanic sank, those ropes got tangled together around those davits.
Titanic carries more lifeboats than regulations require, but still not enough for everyone on board. Some 2,200 people.
You've got to remember, there weren't enough boats to take half the people, and the chances of the other half in that icy cold water were absolutely nil.
Those who survive in Titanic's lifeboats remember their final goodbyes with startling clarity.
Women and children first. Someone was shouting these last few words over and over again. They meant my own safety, but they also meant the greatest loss I've ever suffered.
They started to load
The life of my husband.
My father put Mother and I in without any trouble at all.
My father never said
I never
anything.
saw him again.
He was smoking a cigar. He put my mother and me into a lifeboat.
As I was put into the boat,
and he walked away.
cried and said to me, "It's all right, little girl.
It's all right, little
You
girl.
go. I will
You go.
stay."
I will stay.
As our boat shoved off, he threw me a kiss. And that was the last I saw of him.
Echoes of those last memories are sometimes preserved in objects reclaimed from the deep.
Essentially, I'm in charge of preserving the artifacts that have been recovered from the wreck site. Artifacts are recovered only from the scatter field, and that means things that have been thrown off or out of the ship. So when you find those items, there are a variety of things that really retain life, such as ceramics. China remains in relatively good condition. It might be chipped, it might be broken, but it survives well in a marine environment. Metals, on the other hand, generally do not. Iron is particularly susceptible to corrosion, whereas copper alloys such as bronze, which are used very often on ships for bells and similar items, survives very well. It's important to remember that Titanic was the largest moving object made by man in 1912, and that means it's really big.
While many objects are extremely large, personal items are smaller and more fragile.
We are very fortunate to have recovered paper and textile artifacts from the wreck site. The reason we have them is because they were contained within leather suitcases or bags. The protection of the leather from microorganisms allowed them to be preserved. You begin to build a picture of the person who owned those things. And that's really an exciting moment because you can bring that person back to life. Adolf Saalfeld was a chemist and perfume salesman from Manchester, England. He had a portfolio with him that had 62 vials of new perfume scents that he had developed. He survived, but his perfume container did not, and so we were able to recover that and bring his scents, his fragrances, back to life again.
Once valued possessions are left behind as Titanic sinks lower and lower into the Atlantic. For almost 2.5 hours, Titanic has slowly foundered. In the final moments, things begin to happen much faster.
Now, between lowering one boat and another, I frequently took a run forward and a quick look down the long stairway that led from the boat deck, 3 or 4 decks down. Frankly, I'm never going to forget the sight of that cold, greenish water creeping step by step up that stairway. Some of the lights were shining down on the water, and the others already submerged were giving it a sort of ghastly transparency. I could tell by that staircase measurement exactly what was happening, how far down she'd gone, and how quickly she was going.
"100 years after Titanic goes down, the most complete 3D exploration of the wreck site brings new meaning to first-hand accounts of the sinking. Almost 2 hours after the collision with the iceberg, many of Titanic's passengers are still trapped below deck, behind locked gates.
Meaning we could go up to the second-class deck. But those on second class and steerage could not pass through a guarded gate that led to the first-class upper deck.
Third class felt the impact much more strongly than first or second did, and therefore they felt a sense of urgency that was absent in the upper classes. They also felt the decks begin to pinch, and pretty soon it becomes a question of how do we get up there.
We were told it would be wise to get to the first-class upper deck in order to have a better chance of getting into a lifeboat. The only way this could be done was to climb an iron ladder from the steerage deck below, up 5 or 6 decks to the lifeboats above.
By the time many in third class reach the boat deck, it's too late. By 2 a.m., there's only one official lifeboat left to be launched. To prevent the crowd from rushing it, crewmen link arms. Officer Lightoller pulls his revolver and fires warning shots in the air.
Then came the very last boat of all. It was sort of a raft with collapsible canvas sides stowed upside down on top of the officers' quarters.
Come on, lads, over here! Up here, let's get this one up!
The last lifeboats to be launched were the collapsibles under the #1 funnel. These were 4 bonus boats that White Star had put on in excess of what was legally required. And more importantly, they aren't under their own davits. They're actually stored 1 deck up immediately at the base of the #1 funnel.
Quick, over here! Put that line! Cut it! Does anyone have a knife?
A seaman named Hemming. He'd been with me in many of the mail boats. He and I cut this one adrift and threw it down on the water, which was now about 2 feet above the boat deck.
Come on now! Push! Here she comes!
She's away! Well done, lads!
In the frantic moments loading the last boats, passengers report that an officer fires his gun into the crowd, killing 2 people before turning the gun on himself. Some believe that officer is William Murdoch.
Mr. Murdoch was on the starboard side. I was on the port side.
Murdoch was the deck officer aboard Titanic. He was the one in command of the ship at the time of the accident.
Murdoch is known as a steady and dependable seaman, but his final actions are unclear. Most witnesses agree that shots were fired into the crowd, and an officer took his life. But the identity of that officer has remained a mystery. Did Murdoch die in the line of duty, or was he the one who shot 2 passengers and then turned the gun on himself? One researcher believes the 3D footage holds new clues.
When we look at the wreck, we see the 2 forwardmost davits survive on the ship, the port and the starboard one. Port one was run by Lightoller, Second Officer Lightoller, and it is left in the cranked out position. So what that means is it had essentially launched his last lifeboat and was left in that outboard position. But the one on the starboard side, the one that was supervised by Murdoch, is cranked inboard. And that means it's being ready to accept another boat to be launched. Second Officer Lightoller had said that he had seen Murdoch right at the end working at the falls trying to launch the last collapsible lifeboat when the water overtook him.
I was practically the last man and certainly the last officer to see Mr. Murdoch. He was then endeavouring to launch the starboard forward collapsible boat. He was working hard, personally assisting overhauling the forward boat's fall. Other reports as to the ending are absolutely false. Mr. Murdoch died like a man, doing his duty.
This leather satchel, with the initials WM, is found in the debris field. Its surviving contents include officers' buttons, a shoe brush, and a pipe. Many believe this bag belongs to William Murdoch.
You can see in very fragile condition, but we can replace the strength within the cell walls by immersing it in oils or wax. There are very different materials you can use for this purpose, and therefore you can stabilize it and perhaps regain some of the shape.
The pipe Murdoch is holding in this picture matches the one found in the bag. The buttons match the one Murdoch would have worn on his officer's coat. The initials, WM, are his, but also belong to over a dozen other people on board the Titanic.
There are many things that we will never know, but that doesn't detract from the artifact itself. The artifact has had a very historic experience. To have gone on Titanic, to have gone down 2.5 miles, and then to have come up and survived, that's a lot.
At 2:17 a.m., Titanic sends her last radio message, and Captain Smith issues his final order.
Men, now it's every man for himself.
Titanic's stern becomes the stage for the ship's last desperate human drama.
During the first couple of hours of the disaster, there was steady progressive flooding in the bow, and little by little, the bow lost its buoyancy. You had a situation where the bow was losing almost all of its buoyancy, and the stern, thanks to the famous watertight subdivision that Titanic was known for, remained entirely buoyant.
There were still hundreds of people round. I looked down from the top of the officers' quarters where we were standing, and the ship took a sudden dip. and the sea came rolling up, carrying everyone with it. Many were drowned there and then. Everyone that could just instinctively started to scramble up towards the after end of the ship. But that was only putting it off, and no one's chances were going to be improved by getting mixed up in a struggling mass.
100 years after Titanic sank beneath the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, state-of-the-art 3D cameras are recording high-resolution images of the world's most famous shipwreck. Just past 2 a.m. on April 15, 1912, Second Officer Lightoller is one of the last to abandon the stricken ship as it begins its final plunge to the ocean floor.
I was on top of the officers' quarters, and there was nothing more to be done. The ship took a dive, and I turned face forward and also took a dive. Striking that water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body. The temperature was 28 degrees, 4 degrees below freezing.
At that point, just before the break, you essentially had two ships. One that was going to float and one that wasn't going to float. And they were held together by this little membrane, if you will, and then finally that broke. The bow just plunged into the ocean floor, burying the stem so high up that the anchors, which used to be very high off the surface, are now very close to the bottom.
The 3D footage gathered by this expedition is shedding new light on accounts of Titanic's final moments.
I was sucked down, was driven back against a grating, what we call the fiddly, which leads down to the stokehole, and it was against this grating that I was sucked by the water and held there. Then this explosion, or whatever it was, took place. Certainly, I think it was the boilers exploded. There was a terrific blast of air and water, and I was blown out clear.
Lightoller was sucked against the fiddly grate, and then he was blown clear by warm air coming up from inside the vessel. And some people question that. When I saw the 3D, one thing immediately popped out on me, and that is the grating bars that make up that grate are bowed outward, as though something from inside the ship had pushed it up. So seeing that kind of dimensional aspect to it helped corroborate Lightoller's story.
In fact, I got right near the edge of things before I finally came up alongside that collapsible we'd hove into the water from the top of the officers' quarters. And there, I hung on.
He doesn't realize it yet, but that #1 funnel is going to topple in a few moments. If he did not get on that lifeboat and get away from the scene, he would have been another victim of the #1 funnel, which collapsed during the sinking and crushed a number of people to death.
The funnel, weighing perhaps 50 or 60 tons, fell down with a crash on the water. It missed the raft and some of us hanging onto it by inches. There were a good many it didn't miss. Next thing I remember, I was still hanging on to a bit of rope attached to the raft, but some 30 or 40 yards from the ship. The wash of the falling funnel had evidently picked us up, raft and all, and flung us clear of the ship altogether. Several of us scrambled up on the slippery bottom of the raft, and it was from there I saw the Titanic sink. As I watched, her stern lifted higher and higher till it was right out of the water. There was a sullen sort of rumbling roar as her massive boilers all left their beds and went crashing down through the bulkheads and everything that stood in their way.
In 3D, these indentations or implosion marks are clearly visible for the first time. They suggest that the boilers were hot when the ship sank. They may have been lit for speed, or they could have been lit after the collision to continue to provide power to the ship until it went down.
Up to that moment, she had stood out clear as clear, with her rows of electric lights all burning. When the boilers broke away, she was, of course, plunged into absolute darkness, though her huge black outline was still perfectly distinct up against the stars and sky. Slowly, she reared up on end. Then, quite quietly, but quicker and quicker, she seemed just to slide away under the surface and disappear. As she vanished, Everyone around me on that upturned boat, as though they could hardly believe it just said, "She's gone."
Once the ship sank, the survivors in the lifeboats are immediately presented with a moral question. There's maybe thousands of people in the water, and hundreds of them are now screaming for help. What do you do? A few go back, try to pick some people up, but the general feeling is we'll be swamped. There's too many of them, and the lifeboats stay where they are.
It was terrible. Lots of shouting and people crying as she went down. Never heard anything like it.
The partially filled lifeboat, standing by about 100 yards away, never came back. How could any human being fail to heed those cries?
So many people who perhaps just didn't know what to do or knew that there was nothing they could do. And I think many people made a decision, and for others, the decision was made for them.
Many died from cold during the night, and a mighty long time it seemed before daylight broke. Standing wet through, up to our knees in icy water on that upturned boat, frankly, I don't think many of us expected to see daylight.
The night was bitter cold, and it grew colder and colder. Just before dawn, the coldest, darkest hour of all, no help seemed possible. The stars slowly disappeared, and in their place came the faint pink glow of another day.
1,496 of Titanic's passengers do not live to see that sunrise. 100 years later, high-resolution 3D images allow us to see in intimate detail the ship that failed them, and to better understand what happened in those last few days and minutes.
You don't have to be one of the few that go 2.5 miles down in a submersible to see this wreck. Anybody now is going to be able to see Titanic in 3D. They're going to be able to feel how big this ship is. They're going to be able to distinguish the depth, be able to look into spaces.
Almost 9 hours after the collision, only 712 of the over 2,200 people on board are rescued from the icy Atlantic.
When daylight did break, most of us were still heads up, and we of the upturned boat transferred to one of the lifeboats. At full daylight, there was the Carpathia, steaming towards us. I needn't say just what sort of a welcome sight it was either. Cruising slowly round, she collected boats one by one.
Even as Titanic's passengers are rescued, their possessions are already becoming a part of history. Today, artifacts recovered from the wreck give a new voice to those who survived and those who did not.
I think that's what brings them back to life, and it's a way of honoring their legacy, that they're not forgotten, that someone is actually still trying to find out about their life and who they were 100 years later.
Even if Titanic ultimately became a spot of rust on the seafloor, it will always be one of those places, due to the power of the stories, due to the connections that bind us because of what it means in our hearts, that will always be a special place that people remember, just as surely as we remember other spots where great and sometimes terrible things happened.
At last, everyone was safely on board, and with the 700-odd survivors of that night, she turned away from that tragic spot and headed for New York.